Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the absolute sweeping epic of the American continent. We are going to trace this massive trajectory, literally from the ancient earthworks carved by its very first inhabitants, all the way to the legal ink that ultimately birthed a modern nation. We'll be looking at the foundational history and the environmental legacy of the Americas, pulling from some really fascinating academic analysis and archival records. It's a journey of how this continent was shaped, first physically and then politically.
But to start us off, we actually need to tackle a pretty major historical misconception. When we think about the deep pre-Columbian history of this continent, we often picture indigenous societies just sort of floating in perfect, passive harmony with an untouched wilderness. But we have to ask, were they simply harmonious naturalists, or were they actively engineering the landscape around them? Well, when we actually look at the evidence, it tells a completely different and honestly a much more impressive story.
Here is our agenda for today. We'll be covering four main parts. First, ancient ecological stewardship. Second, sparks of the Revolution. Third, declaring American independence. And fourth, structuring the United States. Let's jump right into Section 1, Ancient Ecological Stewardship, Shaping the Land. For years, historians and anthropologists tended to paint indigenous peoples in one of two really extreme ways, right? It was either the myth of the passive ecological idealist who barely left a footprint, or on the flip side, they were seen as wanton destroyers of the environment. But according to a massive, comprehensive review published in the Journal of Ethnobiology, the reality lands solidly elsewhere. The truth is, they were highly sophisticated, expert landscape managers. The researchers put it perfectly. They weren't just passing through. They were domesticating an unbelievable wealth of crop varieties and literally redesigning entire ecosystems just to survive and thrive. They completely mastered complex resource management to lock down food, fiber, and shelter, which profoundly affected where plants and animals lived across the entire continent. And just think about the sheer scale of these pre-Columbian engineering feats. We are not talking about small backyard gardens here. We're talking vast, sprawling canal networks, intricate ridged field systems, and incredibly complex mountain terracing. Down in the Teotihuacan Valley of Mexico, they built massive public works like the enormous Puron Dam. They were the continent's original civil engineers, laying the literal groundwork for human settlement. Moving on to Section 2, Sparks of the Revolution, Road to Rebellion. All right, let's fast forward a bit to the 18th century. Suddenly, the focus completely shifts from managing the physical soil to a bitter fight over who actually controls the people living on it. Every new, harsher measure of British control acted like a ticking time bomb. It started with the Proclamation of 1763 restricting settlement, then the stamp tax, the Boston Tea Party, right up to that inevitable military clash between colonial Minutemen and British troops at Lexington and Concord in 1775. The tension was just escalating nonstop. So what was the core friction driving all of this? As detailed wonderfully by the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum, it boiled down to a massive disconnect: taxation without representation. Picture this. You have a whole ocean separating the ruling crown from the colonists. The colonists are bleeding money to fund an overextended British military, dealing with strict economic policies, and yet they didn't have a single solitary voice in British Parliament.
But it wasn't strictly about the money. It was the birth of a totally new psychology. Events like the Boston Massacre provided the visceral, emotional outrage needed to unite everyday people. Meanwhile, you had Thomas Paine's publication Common Sense, which gave this incredibly eloquent voice to a uniquely American identity. These catalysts perfectly blended harsh economic realities with a massive ideological awakening, which ultimately triggered the American Revolution.
Which brings us to Section 3, Declaring American Independence, a Sovereign Nation. So, how exactly do you go from a bunch of angry protests in a harbor to a legitimate functioning nation? Well, looking at archival records from the National Archives, the progression was breathtakingly fast. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee proposes a resolution for independence. By July 2nd, the separation is officially adopted. And just 2 days later, Thomas Jefferson's famous Declaration of Independence is proclaimed. In less than a month, a wild ideological leap became a formalized legal reality. Now, historian Howard Zinn offers a really fascinating analysis here. He suggests this document cemented a powerful, necessary myth, a unifying narrative that the revolution was fought on behalf of one truly united people. And honestly, the sheer eloquence of the Declaration was absolutely essential for that.
It had to bind together wildly different colonies, all with competing economic interests, into one cohesive cause against the most powerful empire on the planet.
Just imagine the suffocating summer heat of that room in Philadelphia, the fierce arguments, the compromises, the sheer unprecedented audacity of what those colonial representatives were attempting. They weren't just fighting a war, they were literally inventing a country from scratch, trying to figure out how to transition from rebellious subjects into a recognized sovereign governing body.
And that leads us to Section 4, Structuring the United States, Building a Government. Because tearing down a government is one thing, right? But building a functional one to replace it is an entirely different beast. The pragmatic reality of this evolution took time, and you can trace it through these milestone documents. It started in 1777 with the rather fragile Articles of Confederation. By 1787, they were using the Northwest Ordinance to map out how to govern expanding new territories. And ultimately, that same year, the U.S. Constitution established the enduring framework for the government we know today.
And man, the controversy over adopting this new constitution was intense. It was heavily influenced by figures like Thomas Paine, who represented urban artisans and firmly believed a strong central power was necessary for the greater common interest. Now, this wasn't universally popular. There was this deep, almost ironic tension because many people were terrified that a strong central government would just replicate the exact same British crown they had just bled to overthrow. But ultimately, the desperate need for unity and stability won out. Which brings us to the ultimate culmination of this entire journey, the handwritten preamble of the U.S. Constitution, We the People. It's literally the architectural blueprint of American governance. It's a document that has been studied, debated, and reinterpreted for centuries, much like the physical landscape that it governs. So I want to leave you with this final thought. Consider how the echoes of both those ancient ecosystem builders and the revolutionary founders continue to shape the world we walk on right now. We are still fiercely debating how to manage our natural resources, and we are absolutely still debating the nuances of that Constitution. The past isn't just history, it's the very foundation we are currently standing on. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.